Let's take a look at the Jewish calendar and especially at the feasts, which are a very important part of this calendar. One thing I'd like to say before we get into this too much is that I would like to encourage those of you who are going to be pastors or even active participants in your church to really encourage the people of God to take note of these feasts, because even though we don't celebrate most of them as evangelical Christians, they are feasts that are mentioned in the scriptures and they have significance as it relates to the Messiah himself, the Lord Jesus Christ. Let you see this a little bit closer here. Notice that there are two categories of feasts: the fall feasts and the spring feasts. Now, some have suggested that these feasts correspond to the two advents or the two comings of the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ, and I tend to agree with that. Notice the spring feasts first. There are four of them. Three of them happen in fairly rapid succession: Passover and unleavened bread, and those two are actually mentioned together as pretty much synonymous in the New Testament. So they are presented uniquely and individually in the Old Testament, but they happen back to back. And then the Feast of First Fruits right after that. And of course, Jesus died at Passover, and he gave his body for us. And so the idea of the Passover and unleavened bread does depict the person of Jesus and his sacrifice. And then he rose probably on the actual day of the Feast of First Fruits, which is why he is called the first fruits of those that slept. And then later on, you see the Feast of Pentecost, which takes place around our month of May, usually later in the month of May. And Pentecost in the Old Testament was called the Feast of Weeks, but when the Greek influence, the influence of the language of Greek became dominant worldwide, then the Greek designation Pentecost, or 50th, became the normal term used for this feast. And it's called 50th because it takes place 50 days after the feast of Passover. All right. So, and of course, we know that Pentecost has to do with the founding of the church. And it's good for us to commemorate that each year. So these are all spring feasts that have to do with the first coming of Jesus. And then in the fall, there are feasts that really seem to point to his second coming. You have the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, which depicts the people of Israel living in tents until they settle in the land. And of course, this also depicts the unsettled nature of Israel now until Jesus comes back and establishes his kingdom in the millennium. The Feast of Atonement, or the Day of Atonement, it commemorates that time when the high priest would enter once a year into the Holy of Holies to offer sacrifice on behalf of the people. And of course, that will ultimately be applied when Jesus comes back and all Israel is saved. The remnant of Israel is redeemed, as Paul recognizes in Romans chapter 11. And then the Feast of Trumpets is related to the Jewish New Year, okay, and the beginning of political activities. The Jewish calendar can be a bit difficult to understand because there's a sense in which Passover is the beginning of the year. In fact, when the people of Israel left at the Exodus, God said to them, "This will be the beginning of months for you." But then you have the day, the Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, which also depicts a new year. So how do you have two New Years? Well, the best way to explain it is that Passover is the beginning of the spiritual or religious New Year for Israel, whereas the Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year in October, is the beginning of the political New Year. Now, just to put you at ease, I sat across the table once here at the college with a Jewish believer, very dedicated and seeking to win his fellow Jews for Christ. And he said, if you want an exercise in insanity, try to figure out the Jewish calendar. And he, as a Jewish person, told me that because in addition to these, the Passover and the Jewish New Year in October, you also have the Roman calendar, which begins in January. That's our calendar, which the Jewish nation also has to observe because of international relations. So it does get really, really confusing. Let me show you another one here. This particular calendar adds other feasts other than the 7 that we just pointed out. And of course, these are the Jewish terms transliterated into English. But notice in the fall there, around our September, is Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish political New Year. And then Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. And then Sukkot, or Booths, is the Feast of Tabernacles that we mentioned. Then there's another one called Simchat Torah, which is a special celebration regarding dances and feasting in relation to the Jewish scriptures themselves, the manuscripts. But the other two that I would point out are Hanukkah, which takes place in our December, close to Christmas. That is actually mentioned in the scriptures when Jesus went up to a feast and he says it was winter. Every indication is that is actually the Feast of Hanukkah, which commemorates the Jewish people getting victory over Antiochus Epiphanes back in the days of the Greek domination of Israel. And you may know that story. If not, it's worth reading. We don't have time now to talk about it. And then the Feast of Purim, which would be around our February or March, just before Passover, is connected to the story of Esther. When God gave victory over the enemies of the Jews, then they celebrated with the Feast of Purim. Purim is the word for lots, because remember Haman had cast lots to decide what day he would destroy the Jewish people. And because he failed, the casting of lots became a symbol of victory for the Jewish people. So again, there's a whole lot to this, but I think it's really special for the church to recognize these days when they show up on the Jewish calendar, because there are definite prophecies and there are pointers in each of these feasts indicating something of the nature and ministry of the Messiah, even though they don't believe that the Messiah has yet come. So what are some of these Jewish rituals? Well, Rosh Hashanah, as I said, is the new year. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would enter the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, to make atonement for the people of Israel. Booths or tabernacles representing the wandering in the wilderness in anticipation of the settling in the land. And of course, they did settle in the land of Canaan. That became the modern state of Israel. But there is the ultimate rest that's coming when Israel will cease its wandering in every sense of the word at the coming of Jesus to establish his kingdom. Hanukkah, as I mentioned, dedication, Feast of Dedication, when the temple was purified after Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek ruler there, had defiled it by offering a pig and doing other things. Purim, lots, connected with the story of Esther. And of course, Passover, also known as unleavened bread, depicting the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus as the bread of life for his people. Pentecost is related to the church. Now, we understand the church as being distinct from Israel. The church is a mystery in the Jewish Bible. It's not revealed there. And yet, God chose to initiate the church on the day of Pentecost. And there's a lot of conversation about that. Some would say that in the Old Testament, when the 2 loaves are offered on the day of Pentecost, that somehow refers to the relationship between Israel and the church, even though it's not clearly revealed. Others say that the 2 loaves there refer to the 2 tablets in the law. The Jews actually believe that Pentecost is the day in which God revealed the law to the nation of Israel. So, there's debate as to what that actually indicates. But we do know that the church began on the day of Pentecost because of the revelation given to us in Acts. Now, you may recognize this picture. This young boy is probably about 13, and he is experiencing his bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is a word that means son of the covenant, or son of the commandment. And the word bar is the Aramaic equivalent to ben in Hebrew. Ben meaning son in Hebrew, bar meaning son in Aramaic. And this young man is going through this transition in life from boyhood to adulthood by experiencing his bar mitzvah. And it involves quite a ritual. And you might remember that Jesus himself experienced that. He was at the temple when he was 12, probably there the year before his bar mitzvah, because younger boys who were preparing for their bar mitzvah would be permitted to sit at the feet of the elders the year before their bar mitzvah in order to kind of learn and get the feel for what it was like. And then I'm going to end with this one, showing the ultra-Orthodox Jewish wedding in Israel. One of the ways that you can tell an ultra-Orthodox Jew is by the way that they dress. Jewish men will wear black, and many of them will wear hats of some sort. Their hairstyles may be different. Some may have beards of different kinds. Excuse me. There are different kinds of orthodoxy. In fact, some have said that there are as many as 24 different kinds of Jewish orthodoxy, ultra-Orthodox Jews. And the best way to identify them is by noting the way they dress. And that varies from group to group. And here's a picture of a Jewish wedding. And you can see all the men dressed pretty much in the same way. And the girl being introduced to her husband. And I just, one of the things I want to bring to mind in this is a reminder that in the Old Testament, Jehovah was often referred to as the husband of Israel. And of course, Israel, being unfaithful to her husband, left and was eventually judged as a result. But the story of Hosea is a picture of God coming after his straying wife and bringing her back to himself, which is what Jesus is going to do. And so even though a practicing Jew, an Orthodox Jew, would not recognize this to be true, that's exactly what happened with the Lord Jesus Christ. He, the husband, if you will, of Israel, was rejected by his own people, but someday when he returns, he will be embraced by the remnant that Paul discusses in Romans chapter 11, and then they will become his people once again. Now, the reason I mention that is because there are evangelical groups who believe in what we call replacement theology, that God is done with Israel altogether, and that the church has replaced Israel. So all the promises that were given to Israel in the Old Testament now apply to the church. We here at the college very strongly reject that teaching. We believe that God is going to redeem the nation of Israel. Even though it's just a remnant, it is going to be the actual ethnic nation of Israel. And they will come to him, and then during the millennium, of course, they will grow and prosper. So when you look at a picture like this of a Jewish wedding, that's something to keep in mind. And of course, we know that the church is also referred to as the bride of Christ. So that intimacy between the husband of Israel and the wife in the Old Testament does carry over to Jesus being referred to as the husband of the bridegroom of the church. So there are relations between the church and the nation of Israel that in relation to God and who he is and how he relates to us. It's all very fascinating. There's a lot to it. And we'll take a look at a little bit more in just a moment.